Welcome back. Now, controversy is trailing the federal government's policy, which approved a 40% auto deduction from the gross internally generated revenue of all partially funded federal government institutions and payable into the Federation account. A memo from the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation states that the auto deduction policy of gross IGR now was in line with the finance circular dated December 20th, 2021. Furthermore, all statutory revenue lines like tender fees, contractors' registration fees, disposal of fixed assets, rent on quarters, etc., shall be remitted 100% to the sub-recurrent account. Now, this development comes shortly after the federal government had hinted that it was granting universities full autonomy to explore sources of financing their activities. The Minister of Education, Tahir Mamman, said the aim is to grant full autonomy to the universities as part of government's effort now to create a new means of funding tertiary education. However, key players across the education sector have kicked against the policy, saying it will strangulate the activities of the affected tertiary institutions and also deprive them of embarking on major infrastructure and critical projects that would put the institutions now at par with their counterparts elsewhere. All right, joining me now to shed more light on this issue is Professor Francis Egwokare, who is a professor of linguistics at the University of Ibadan. Prof, thank you very much for joining us on the program. What do you make of this policy by the federal government?
Well, it's really, it doesn't look logical because once you say you are granting autonomy, then you are giving the flexibility for institutions to deal with the problems, their finances. Now, the other problem is that the federal government also is giving the loans to students. And right from the beginning, you are taxing those same students 40% of those loans. That in itself is a problem.
Basically, you're saying that this is like taxing the students again.
Yes, it's a taxation because then there are service charges for accommodation, for ICT and so on. These are service charges that are transferred to third parties. Now you are going to have to now pay 40% of that. So it's an additional burden because the universities will have to make up the additional 40% from that by putting that on the cost for students. And that also means that external grants, donations by other individuals and alumni will also be taxed 40%. I think there is really a problem about the thinking frame behind this decision. And I think maybe my suspicion is that probably has not, the position of government has not actually been well stated because this is unbelievable. Actually, it's unbelievable. The other bigger problem really is that the institutions will now become indolent. The need to generate funds now, you will discover that there will be a rapid reduction in terms of fund generation by institutions and by staff. So that because at the end of the day, you take 40% from the institutions that are performing well, and 40% from institutions that are not performing well, there is no parity because you will be taking from some that are performing well to subsidize those that are not performing well. So I think there is a problem really in terms of the lack of systems thinking in terms of how this decision has been extended to universities.
And I think I see your point, because if you're giving students loans to pay school fees and all of that, pay other fees, and then which of course you would think that would be revenue now coming to the institutions, and then on the other hand you're taking 40% of that away.
40% from it.
Obviously, it's like I get your point now. I really get your point. But what do you think? How do you think the government should address this issue of autonomy for universities, and especially when it comes to the issue of funding?
I think basically for funding, what government needs to do is to develop parameters and frameworks for determining exactly the actual needs of institutions. I don't think anybody in Nigeria today knows what the actual needs are. They are based on speculations and then of opinions of so-called experts. And then, of course, also frameworks that are no longer relevant. For instance, I would expect that a university that has employed more staff than is actually required, they can go ahead and source for funds to pay those staff. once they have agreed with government on what the baseline requirements are, I will expect that government should agree with universities, determine exactly what the parameters for funding should be, and then we adhere strictly to those parameters and demand performance management, performance from these institutions, return on investment. But we don't even know exactly what exactly the institutions actually need. Some estimates are based on an overbloated sense of what the needs are in terms of abuses. There are abuses in the system, which also translate into excessive demands from some institutions. And then, of course, there are the issues of corruption, which also has to be handled. What then government needs to do is to sit with the committee of vice chancellors, bring in experts, develop performance management parameters, disaggregate the data in such a way that government can monitor exactly what is spent and how money is expended, and then determine exactly how much they are willing to pay per student, per institution, based on a number of, based on disciplines, based on locations, and so on and so forth. And I think the most important thing is that student mobility must be promoted as well, so that students can also move from one institution to the other, unencumbered, unhindered. In this way, universities will be forced to improve their services, where the student becomes kings. Services will improve when institutions are competing with one another in order to attract students. And I think this is basically the business approach to it. It's not by simply imposing levies. This levy system is a carryover from the past. Before now, the Buhari administration was deducting 25% from the funds of institutions, so-called IGR, which are not really IGRs in many cases. And universities are barely able to pay for electricity, barely able to pay for municipal services. So we need to go back and do a thorough examination of the system. Let us know where the redundancies are. Let us know exactly what the actual costs are. Let's develop a framework for performance management. Let's have an open and transparent financial accountability system. And then, of course, the oversight agencies, let us also stop them from extorting institutions, because whether you talk about the Office of Accountant General or Auditor General or Office or the legislative oversight functions, there's a lot of extortion that is going on. As I'm speaking with you now also, a number of chief executive officers of institutions spend a lot traveling between their locations and Abuja. They are hardly on ground even to pretend over their institutions because of one need or the other to be in Abuja. This is not the way to go. There must be a more programmed, predictable way of managing institutions. And then, of course, we can then begin to talk about cost cutting. I am actually in support of autonomy, but financial autonomy cannot be legislated. It must be discussed so that we know exactly what level of autonomy. But autonomy will not necessarily translate into rascality on the part of the institutions, because many Nigerian tertiary institutions have actually abused the limited autonomy that they have. But all of these things can be handled where there is transparency, where the will is there, where, for instance, the government itself really is interested in improving the quality of institutions. All these things can be handled.
But then you look at the tertiary institutions in the country today, as it stands today. Do you think they have the capacity to embrace full autonomy, especially financial autonomy now? Can they actually survive it?
No, well, you know, the situation varies from institution to institution. I think part of the problem of a centralized system is overgeneralization of failure. You know, and that this is where the big problem of exponential decay. When you have one system, you have basically a leadership at the top of a system. The decay now cascades down the whole entire system. Now, there are institutions that will survive. There are institutions that will not be able to survive. Now, I think basically what government should do is to give a grant to institutions from the beginning. This is how much we are going to be able to give. So institutions that cannot survive. You see, we must be willing to allow some institutions to fail. Basically, this is my own, because you can't be behaving
How do you mean now? How do you mean? Could you explain that?
Now, if an institution gets grants from government and it cannot manage it because it has put mediocres in all kinds of positions, it should be, if the people cannot check their institutions, they should be allowed to fail. And then, of course, they will pay the price for it. But you see, before government can come with the moral high ground to do this, government must itself determine the kinds of people you appoint to councils. You can't appoint somebody, appoint a council that is worthless and expect that the governance parameters of the governance quality of an institution will be such that will lead to growth and development. So politicization of council is one critical issue. Let government appoint individuals to council who have the capacity and the management skill to be able to manage. Then the local institutions themselves must stop playing politics with their council membership. But if at the end of the day you give a certain amount of grants to these institutions and you say, okay, this is how much we are from our own calculation of your needs, because you don't just give people money because they say this is their needs. There are rational ways of costing these needs. We'll give you these grants over a period of X number of years. Now you have to rise and fall after this number of years with the grants, and then institute scholarship systems, not just a loan system, because we are seeing the loan system is collapsing in the US now. It's a terrible thing when you look at what is happening to loans. Our system is not at the level of maturity even of the American system. So the problem we face sometimes is the negative effect of legacy thinking. Everything that is done outside will come and we think we can import it here. We talk about standards and we think that the standards are global. There is nothing like that. Our contexts are so different. There has to be there is asymmetry in terms of the experiences that we have here and the experiences that we see elsewhere. So there is a need to contextualize, and then there is a need to support our decision with data. I don't know the data on which a lot of decisions that are taken are based. You know, people always talk about opinions of experts talking. It's not enough to have an expert say something. The part of the problem of this country is that we are dealing with a country that no longer exists. The data we use does not represent Nigeria of today. So we have to get back to the question of real research, accurate baseline data disaggregated along critical parameters that are relevant to our nation, and then we can carry out informed decision on the basis of Nigeria of today, and then we can project into the future. But the way we are going about it, it looks as if we think that an accident will happen that will bring about development. It's not going to happen. We will just be celebrating inanities, holding meetings and workshops, you know, for expenditure, to spend money, and then making trips all over the world in order, and then cranking together plans that are taken by a number of people in hotel rooms.
Now, you look at this policy and you look at some of the issues that you have highlighted there. How do you reconcile all of them with, you know, the consistent, if you like, establishment now, if you like, of new universities, especially federal universities in the country? I mean, we just can count the number of universities that have been set up by the federal government in the past 10 years. And we're seeing that there are even plans, there are agitations by some groups and some states and some communities for federal universities to be established in their areas and all of that. And I'm wondering, in the face of all of these issues that you have highlighted, in the face of this plan to deduct 40% from the IGR of universities, how does it stack up against the frequent establishment of universities across the country by the federal government?
Well, you see, the federal government and the state governments are really part of the problem of this country when it comes to education. Just in the last how many weeks, about 6 more universities have been created. Now, we are complaining about universities, but we are trying to make universities look more like polytechnics, and we want to make polytechnics look like universities. It shows that there's a problem with our thinking frame. Now, you cannot be complaining about quality and then you are multiplying numbers for public universities. And this is part of the challenge. So, within the context of this economy, we shall have to ask ourselves whether, since the federal government is complaining and the state government are complaining that they don't have funds, how do they want the funds to come, even if they themselves are so indebted? The federal government is indebted, the state governments are indebted, yet they think that some magics will happen with the institutions they are creating. I cannot speak for the private sector. If the private individual thinks he has enough money to establish a private university or a private polytechnic and so on, all well and good once they satisfy the regulations, because you cannot stop people from investing in any sector, in business. That's just but you can regulate the way they go about it. But for the federal government to be complaining that it has no funds, that universities should, and the tertiary institutions should take care of their funds, what we are saying is we are seeing a problem of planning without purpose and management without ideology. And you see, where a country lacks vision, this is what really happens. So we have to come back to the brass tacks. Let us even tell ourselves the basic truth. We have a resource. We are not a resource-rich country. We don't have enough money to be able to deal with the kinds of problems that are besetting the country today. So what do? We have to be resource efficient. We have to do value engineering, determine exactly what kind of values in terms of the return on investment. We have to look at such issues. Where do we want to head to as a country? How do we manage our scarce resources in order to leverage what we have in order to get to where we want to get to? This will not happen by accident. It will not happen by politicking. It's not going to happen by simple narratives. It needs disciplined thinking.
Professor Francis Egbokare, Professor of Linguistics at the University of Ibadan, thank you very much for coming on the show, and thank you for talking to us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so very much, sir. All right, that's how much we can take on the program this week. But thank you very much for watching. I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.